Hi everybody, and I'm so sorry I cannot show you my face. Sorry for that. Sorry that I can't show you my face. Yes, sorry. But that's fine. I hope it's okay. Okay, I'm going to chat. Yeah. All right. I want to continue reading Bridgerton, and now I'm going to continue to chapter 13. Let me go to chapter 13. Yes. Chapter 13. All at home is pleasant and well, and Martin thrives under Francesca's careful stewardship. She continues to mourn John, but then of course, so do we all, as I'm sure do you. You might consider writing to her directly. I know that she misses you. I do pass along all of your tales, but I am certain you would relate them to her in a different fashion than you do to your mother. From Helen Sterling to her son, the Earl of Carmarthen, 2 years after his departure for India. The rest of the week passed in a supremely annoying blur of flowers, candy, and one appalling display of poetry recited aloud. Michael recalled with a shudder on his front step. Francesca, it seemed, was putting all the fresh-faced debutantes to shame. The number of men vying for her hand might not have been doubling every day, but it certainly felt like it to Michael, who was constantly tripping over lovesick swing in the hall. It was enough to make a man want to vomit, preferably on the lovesick swing. Of course, he had his admirers as well, but as it was not suitable for a lady to call upon a gentleman, he generally only had to deal with them when he closed to do so, and not when they took it up themselves to stop by unannounced and for no apparent reason other than to compare his eyes to. Well, to whatever one could compare your average gray eyes. It was a stupid analogy anyway, although Michael had been forced to listen to more than one man rhapsodize over Francesca's eyes. Good God, didn't any of them have an original thought in his head? Forget that everyone made mention of her eyes. At the very least, one of them could have had the creativity to compare them with something other than the water or the sky. Michael nodded with disgust. Anyone who took the time to really look at Francesca's eyes would have realized that they were quite their own color, as if the sky could even compare. Furthermore, Francesca's nauseating parade of suitors was made all more difficult to bear by Michael's complete inability to stop thinking about his recent conversation with her brother. Married to Francesca? He had never even let himself think about such a notion. But now it gripped him with a fervor and intensity that left him reeling. Married to Francesca. Good God! Everything about it was wrong, except he wanted it so badly. It was hell watching her, hell speaking to her, hell living in the same house. He'd thought it was difficult before, loving someone who could never be his. But this was 1,000 times worse. Colin knew. He had to know. Why would he have suggested it if he didn't? Michael had helped on his sanity all these years for one reason and one reason only. No one knew he was in love with Francesca, except apparently he was to be denied even that last shred of dignity. But now Colin knew, or at least he damned well suspected. Michael couldn't quite squash this rising sense of panic within his chest. Colin knew, and Michael was going to have to do something about it. Dear God, what if he told Francesca? That question was foremost in his mind, even now, as he stood slightly off to the side of the Berwick ball, nearly a week after his momentous meeting with Colin. She looks beautiful tonight, doesn't she? It was his mother's voice at his ear. He had forgotten to pretend that he wasn't watching Francesca. He turned to Helen and gave her a little bow. "Mother," he murmured. "Doesn't she?" Helen persisted. Of course, he agreed quickly enough, so she might think he was just being polite. Green suits her. Everything suited Francesca. But he wasn't about to tell his mother that. So he just nodded and made a murmur of agreement. "You should dance with her." "I'm sure I will," he said, taking a sip of his champagne. He wanted to march across the ballroom and forcibly remove her from her annoying little crowd of admirers. But he couldn't very well show such emotion in front of his mother. So he concluded with, "After I finish my drink." Helen pursed her lips. Her dance card will surely be filled by then. You should go now. He turned to his mother and smiled, just the sort of devilish grin designed to take her mind of whatever it was that had her so fixated. Now, why would I do that? He queried, setting his champagne flute down on a nearby table. When I can dance with you instead. You rascal, Helen said, but she didn't protest when he led her out on the floor. Michael knew he'd pay for this tomorrow. Already the society matrons were circling him for the kill, and there was nothing they liked better than a rake who doted upon his mother. The dance was a lively one, which didn't allow for much conversation, and as he twisted and turned, dipped and bowed, he kept catching glances of Francesca, radiant in her emerald gown. No one seemed to notice that he was watching her, which suited him just fine, except that as the music reached its penultimate crescendo, Michael was forced to make one final turn away from her. And when he turned back to face her again, she was gone. He frowned. That didn't seem right. He supposed she could have darted out to the ladies' retiring room, but pathetic fool that he was, he'd been watching her closely enough that he knew that she had done that just 20 minutes earlier. He completed his dance with his mother, bade her farewell, and then ambled casually over to the north side of the room where he'd last seen Francesca. He had to move quickly, lest someone try to waylay him, but he kept his ears open as he moved through the crowds. No one, however, seemed to be speaking of her. When he reached her previous location, however, he noticed French doors, presumably to the back garden. They were curtained and closed, of course. It was only April and now not warm enough to be letting the night air in, even with a crowd of 300 heating up the room. Michael was instantly suspicious. He'd lured too many women out to gardens himself not to be aware of what could happen in the dark of the night. He slipped outside, unobstructive, making his exit unobtrusive. If Francesca was indeed out in the back garden with a gentleman, the last thing he wanted was a crowd trailing in his wake. The rumble of the party seemed to pulsate through the glass doors, but even with that, the night felt quiet. Then he heard her voice. And it sliced his gut. She sounded happy, he realized, more than the content to be in the company of whatever man had lured her into the dark. Michael couldn't make out her words, but she was definitely laughing. It was a musical, tinkling sound, and it ended in a soul-searing, flirtatious murmur. Michael put his hand back on the knob. He should leave. She wouldn't want him here. But he was rooted to the spot. He'd never, ever spied on her with John. Not once had he listened in a conversation that was meant to include him. If he stumbled within earshot, he had always removed himself immediately. But now it was different. He couldn't explain it, but it was different and he could not force himself to leave. One more minute, he swore to himself. That was all. One more minute to assure that she was not in dangerous situation. And no, no, Francesca's voice. His ears pricked up and he took a few steps in the direction of her voice. She didn't sound upset, but she was saying no. Of course, she could be laughing about a joke or maybe some inane piece of gossip. I really must. No. And that was all it took for Michael to move. Hello, Izudin. Hi, Izudin. Thank you for joining my live streaming again. Saya bilang Izudin tapi ini Julian gitu ya. But actually yeah, I'm waving to Izudin. Okay, let me continue. Francesca knew that she shouldn't have come outside with Sir Geoffrey Fowler, but he had been polite and charming, and she was feeling a trifle warm in the crowded ballroom. It was the sort of thing she'd never have done as an unmarried debutante. But widows weren't held to quite the same standards, and besides, Sir Geoffrey had said that he would leave the door ajar. All had been perfectly pleasant for the first few minutes. Sir Geoffrey made her laugh, and he made her feel beautiful, and it was almost heartbreaking to realize how much she'd missed that. And so she had laughed and flirted and allowed herself to melt into the moment. She wanted to feel like a woman again. Maybe not in fullest sense of the word, but still, was it so wrong to enjoy the heady intoxication of knowing that she was desired? Maybe they were all after her now in famous double dowry. Maybe they wanted the alignment with two of Britain's most notable families. Francesca was both a Bridgerton and a Sterling, after all. But for one lovely evening, she was going to let herself believe it was all about her. But then Sir Geoffrey had moved closer. Francesca had backed up as discreetly as she was able, but he took another step in her direction, and then another, and before she knew it, her back was against a fat trunked tree, and Sir Geoffrey's hands were planted against the bark, each uncomfortably close to her head. Sir Geoffrey, Francesca said, endeavoring to remain polite as long as she possibly could. I'm afraid there has been a misunderstanding. I believe I would like to return to the party. She kept her voice light and friendly, not wishing to provoke him into something she would regret. His head dipped an inch closer of hers. Now, why would you want to do that? He murmured. No, no, she said, ducking to the side as he came in closer. People will be missing me. Dash it all. She was going to have to stamp on his foot, or worse, unman him in the manner her brothers had taught her back when she was a green girl. Sir Geoffrey, she said, trying one last time for civility. I really must. And then his mouth, wet and mushy, entirely unwelcome, landed on hers. No, she managed to squeal, but he was quite determined to mash her with his lips. Francesca twisted his way and that, but he was stronger than she had realized, and he clearly had no intention of letting her escape. Still struggling, she maneuvered her leg so that she might jam her knee up into his groin, but before she could do that, Sir Geoffrey seemed to quite simply disappear. Oh, the surprised sound flew from her lips of its own accord. There was a flurry of movement, a noise that sounded rather sickeningly like knuckles on flesh, and one very heartfelt cry of pain. By the time Francesca had any idea what was going on, Sir Geoffrey was sprawled on the ground, swearing most vehemently, and a large man loomed over him, his boot planted firmly on Sir Geoffrey's chest. Michael, Francesca asked, unable to believe her eyes. Say the word, Michael said in a voice she had never dreamed could cross his lips, and I will crush his ribs. No, Francesca said quickly. She'd not have felt the least bit guilty for kneeing Sir Geoffrey between the legs, but she didn't want Michael to kill the man. And from the look of Michael's face, she was quite certain he would have happily done so. That's not necessary, she said, hurrying to Michael's side and then backing up when she saw the feral gleam in his eyes. Perhaps we could just ask him to leave. For a moment, Michael did nothing but stare at her, hard in the eyes, with an intensity that robbed her of the ability to breathe. Then he ground his boot down into Sir Geoffrey's chest, not too very much harder, but enough to make the supine man grunt with discomfort. Are you certain? Michael bit off. Yes, please. There's no need to hurt him, Francesca said. Good heavens, this would be a nightmare if anyone caught them thus. Reputation would be tarnished, and heaven knew what they'd say about Michael, attacking a well-respected baronet. I shouldn't have come out here with him, she added. No, you shouldn't have done, Michael said harshly. But that hardly gives him leave to force his intentions on you. Abruptly, he removed his boot from Sir Geoffrey's chest and hauled the quivering man to his feet. Grabbing him by his lapels, he pinned him against the tree and then jerked his own body forward until the two men were nearly nose to nose. Doesn't feel so good to be trapped, does it? Michael taunted. Sir Geoffrey said nothing, just stared at him in terror. Do you have something to say to the lady? Sir Geoffrey shook his head frantically. Michael slammed his head back against the tree. Think harder, he growled. I'm sorry, Sir Geoffrey squeaked. Rather like a girl, Francesca thought dispassionately she'd known he wouldn't make a good husband, but that clinched it. But Michael was not through with him. If you ever step within 10 yards of Lady Martin again, I will personally disembowel you. Even Francesca flinched. Am I understood? Michael grounded out. Another squeak, and this time Sir Geoffrey sounded like he might cry. Get out of here, Michael grunted, shoving the terrified man away. And while you're at it, endeavor to leave town for a month or so. Sir Geoffrey looked at him in shock. Michael stood still, dangerously so, and then she shrugged one insolent shoulder. You won't be missed, he said softly. Francesca realized she was holding her breath. He was terrifying, but he was also magnificent, and it shook her to her very core to realize that she'd never seen him thus. Sir never dreamed he could be like this. Sir Geoffrey ran off, heading across the lawn to the back gate, leaving Francesca alone with Michael, alone and for the first time since she'd known him without a word to say, except perhaps, I'm sorry. Michael turned on her with a ferocity that nearly sent her reeling. Don't apologize, he beat off. No, of course not, he said, but I should have known better. And he should have known better, he said savagely. It was true, and Francesca was certainly not going to take the blame of her attack. But at the same time, she thought it best not to feed his anger any further, at least not right now. She'd never seen him like this. In truth, she'd never seen anyone like this, wound so tightly with worry that he seemed as if he might snap into pieces. She'd thought he was out of control, but now, as she watched him, standing so still she was afraid to breathe, she realized that the opposite was true. Michael was holding onto his control like Michael was holding onto his control like a vice. If he hadn't, Sir Geoffrey would be lying in a bloody heap right now. Francesca opened her mouth to say something more, something placating or even funny, but she found herself without words, without the ability to do anything but watch him. This man she thought she knew so well. There was something mesmerizing. There was something mesmerizing about the moment, and she couldn't take her eyes off him. He was breathing hard, obviously still struggling to control his anger. And he was, she realized with curiosity, not entirely there. He was staring at some far off horizon, his eyes unfocused, and he looked almost in pain. Michael, she whispered. No reaction. Michael! This time she reached out and touched him, and he flinched, whipping around so quickly that she stumbled backward. What is it? He asked gruffly. Nothing, she stammered, not certain what it was she'd meant to say, not even certain if she'd had something to say other than his name. He closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them, clearly waiting for her to say more. I believe I will go home, she said. The party no longer held appeal. All she wanted to do was cocoon herself where all was safe and familiar. Because Michael was suddenly neither of those things. I will make you apologize inside, he said stiffly. I'll just send the carriage back for you and the mothers, Francesca added. The lush she'd looked Janet and Helen were enjoying themselves immensely. She didn't want to cut their evening short. Shall I escort you? Shall I escort you through the back gate? Or would you rather go through the ball? The back gate, I think, she said. And he did. The full distance to the carriage, his hand burning at her back the entire way. But when she reached the carriage, instead of accepting his assistance to climb up, she turned to him, a question suddenly burning on her lips. How did you know? I was in the garden, she inquired. He didn't say anything, or maybe he would have done, just not quickly enough to soothe her. Were you watching me? She asked. His lips curved, not quite into a smile, not even into the beginning of a smile. I'm always watching you, he said grimly. And she was left with that to ponder for the rest of the evening. Chapter 14. Did Francesca said that she misses me, or did you merely infer it? From the Earl of Kilmartin to his mother, Helen Sterling, 2 years and 2 months after his departure for India. 3 hours later, Francesca was sitting in her bedroom back at Martin House when she heard Michael return. Janet and Helen had come home quite a bit earlier, and when Francesca had somewhat purposefully run into them in the hall, that informed her that Michael had chosen to run out this evening with a visit to his club. Most likely to avoid her, she decided, even though there was no reason for him to expect to see her at such late hour. Still, she had left the ball earlier that evening with the distinct impression that Michael did not desire her company. He had defended her honor with all the valor and purpose of a true hero, but she couldn't help but feel that it was done almost reluctantly, as if it was something he had to do, not something he wanted to do. And even worse, that she was someone whose company he had to endure, rather than the cherished friend she had always told herself she was. That she realized hurt. Francesca told herself that when he returned to Kilmartin House, she would leave well enough alone. She would do nothing but listen at the doors as he tramped down the hallway to his bedchamber. She was honest enough with herself to admit that she was not above, and in fact fundamentally unstable to resist eavesdropping. Then she would scoot over to the heavy oak door that connected their rooms, locked on both sides since her return from her mother's. She certainly didn't fear of Michael. But properties were properties, and then listen there a few minutes longer. She had no idea what she'd be listening for, or even why she felt the need to hear his footsteps as he moved about his room, but he simply had to do it. Something had changed tonight, or maybe nothing had changed, which might have been worse. Was it possible that Michael had never been the man she'd thought he was? Could she have been so close to him for so long, counted him as one of her dearest friends, even when they'd be estranged, and still not known him? She'd never dreamed that Michael might have secrets from her. From her. Everyone else maybe, but not her. And it left her feeling rather off balance and untidy, almost as if someone had come up to Kilmartin House and shoved a pile of bricks under the south wall, setting the entire world at a drunken slant. No matter what she did, no matter what she thought, she still felt as if she were sliding to where she didn't know, and she didn't dare hazard a guess. But the ground was most definitely no longer firm beneath her feet. Her bedroom faced the front of Kilmartin House, and when all was quiet, she could hear the front door close, provided the person closing it did so with enough force. It didn't need to be slammed, but well, whatever firmness it required, Michael evidently was exercising it because she had the telltale thunk beneath her feet, followed by a low rumble of voices, presumably prettily chatting with him as he took his coat. Michael was home, which meant she could finally just go to bed and at least pretend to sleep. He was home, which meant that it was time to declare the evening officially over. She should put this behind her, move on, maybe pretend nothing all happened. But when she heard his footsteps coming up to the stairs, she did one thing she never would have expected herself to do. She opened the door and dashed out into the hall. She had no idea what she was doing, not even a clue. By the time her bare feet touched the runner carpet, she was so shocked at her own actions that she found herself somewhat frozen and out of breath. Michael looked exhausted and surprised and heart-stoppingly handsome, with his cravat slightly loosened and his midnight hair falling in wavy locks over his forehead, which left her wondering, when had she begun to notice how handsome he was? It had always been something that had simply been there, but she knew in an intellectual sense, but she never really took note of. But now, her breath caught. Now his beauty seemed to fill the air around her, swirling about her skin, leaving her shivery and hot all the same time. Francesca, Michael said, her name more of a tired statement than anything else. And of course, she had nothing to say. It was so unlike her to do something like this, to rush in without thinking about what she was planning. But she didn't particularly feel like herself that evening. She was so unsettled, so off balance, and the only thought in her head, if indeed there had been any, before dashing out her door was that she had to see him, just catch a glimpse and maybe hear his voice. If she could convince herself that he really was the person she thought she knew, then maybe she was still the same too. Because she didn't feel like the same, and it shook her to the core. Michael, she said, finally finding her voice. Good evening. He just looked at her, raising one brow at her remarkably meaningless statement. She cleared her throat. I wanted to make sure you were, all right. The ending sounded a little weak, even to her ears, but it was the best adjective she could come up with on such short notice. I'm fine, he said gruffly, just tired. Of course, she said. Of course, of course. He smiled, but entirely without humor. Of course. She swallowed, then tried to smile, but it felt forced. I didn't thank you earlier, she said. For what? For coming to my aid, she replied, thinking that ought to be obvious. I would have, well, I would have defended myself. At this wry glance, she added, somewhat defensively, my brothers show me how. He crossed his arms and looked down at her in a vaguely paternalistic manner. In that case, I'm sure you would have rendered him a soprano in no time. She pinched her lips together. Regardless, she said, deciding not to comment upon his sarcasm. I very much appreciated not having to, er, she blushed. Oh God, she hated when she blushed. Knee him with the ballocks, Michael finished helpfully, one corner of his mouth curving into a mocking smile. Indeed, she ground out, quite convinced that her cheeks had gone from pink straight to crimson, skipping all shades of rose, fuchsia, and red along the way. You're quite welcome, he said abruptly, giving her a nod that this was meant to indicate the end of the conversation. Now, if you will excuse me. He moved as if heading for his bedroom door, but Francesca wasn't quite ready, and she was certain that the devil himself only knew why. To the end of the conversation. Wait, she called out. gulping when she realized that now she was going to have to say something. He turned around, slowly and with a strange sense of deliberation. Yes, I just. He waited while she floundered, then finally said, "Can it wait until morning?" "No, wait!" At this time she reached out and grabbed his arm. He froze. "Why are you so angry with me?" she whispered. He just shook his head, as if he couldn't quite believe her question. But he didn't take his eyes off her hand on his arm. "What are you talking about?" he asked. "Why are you so angry with me?" she repeated, and she realized that she hadn't even realized she'd felt this way until the words had left her lips. But something wasn't right between them, and she had to know why. "Don't be ridiculous," he muttered. "I mean, I'm not angry with you. I'm merely tired, and I want to go to bed." "You are. I'm sure you are." Her voice was rising with conviction. Now that she'd said it, she knew it was true. He tried to hide it, and he'd become quite accomplished at apologizing when it slipped to the fore. But there was anger inside him, and it was directed at her. Michael placed his hand over hers. Francesca gasped at the heat of the contact, but then all he did was lift her hand off of his arm and allow it to drop. "I'm going to bed," he announced. And then he turned his back on her, walked away. "No, you can't go," she dashed after him, unthinking, unheedful, right into his bedroom. If he hadn't been angry before, he was now. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. "You can't just dismiss me," she protested. He stared at her, hard. "You are in my bedchamber," he said in a low voice. "I suggest you to leave. Not until you explain to me what is going on." Michael held himself perfectly still. His every muscle had frozen into hard, stiff line, and it was a blessing, really, because if he'd allowed himself to move, if he'd felt even capable of moving, he would have lunged at her, and what he would do when he caught her was anyone's guess. He'd been pushed to the edge, first by her brother, and then by Sir Geoffrey. and now by Francesca herself, standing in front of him without a bloody clue. His world had been overturned by a single suggestion. Why don't you just marry her? It dangled before him like a ripe apple, a wicked possibility that shouldn't be his to take. John, his conscience pondered. John, remember John. Francesca, he said, like voice hard and controlled. It is well past midnight, and you are in the bedchamber of a man to whom you are not married. I suggest you leave. But she didn't. But she didn't. Damn her. She didn't even move. She just stood there, 3 feet past the still open doorway, staring at him as if she'd never seen him before. He tried not to notice that her hair was loose. He tried not to see that she was wearing her night clothes. They were demure, yes, but still meant to be removed, and his gaze kept dipping to the silken hem which brushed the top of her foot, allowing him a tantalizing peek at her toes. Good God! He was staring at her toes. Her toes! What had his life come to? Why are you angry with me? She asked again. I'm not, he snapped. I just want you to get the. He caught himself at the last moment. To get out of my room. Is it because I wish to remarry? She asked, her voice choked with emotion. Is that it? He didn't know how to answer, so he just glared at her. You think I'm betraying John? She said accusingly. You think I should spend my days mourning your cousin? Michael closed his eyes. No, Francesca, he said wearily. I would never. But she wasn't listening. Do you think I don't mourn him? She demanded. Do you think I don't think about him each and every day? Do you think it feels good to know that when I marry, I'll be making a mockery of the sacrament? He looked at her. She was breathing hard, caught up in her anger and maybe her grief as well. What I had with John, she said, her entire body shaking now. I'm not going to find with any of the men sending me flowers, and it feels like a desecration, a selfish desecration that I'm even considering remarrying. If I didn't want a baby so damned much. She broke off, maybe from over emotion, maybe just at the shock of having actually cursed aloud. She stood there, blinking, her lips parted and quivering, looking as if she might break at the merest touch. He should have been more sympathetic. He should have tried to comfort her, and he would have done both of those things if they had been in any other room besides his bedchamber. But as it was all he could do just to control his breathing, and himself. She looked back up at him, her eyes huge and heart-stoppingly blue. Even in the candlelight, you don't know, she said. Turning away, she walked to a long, low row of drawers. She leaned heavily against it, her fingers beating the wood. You just don't know, she whispered, her back still to him. And somehow, that was more than he could take. He had walked her way in here, demanding answers when she didn't even understand the questions. She'd invaded his bedchamber, pushed him to the limit, and now she was just going to dismiss him, turn her back on him, and tell him he didn't know? Don't know what, he demanded, just before he crossed the room. His feet were silent but swift, and before he knew it was right behind her, close enough to touch, close enough to grab what he wanted, and she wheeled around. You, and then she stopped. And then she stopped, didn't make another sound, did nothing but allow her eyes to lock onto his. Michael, she whispered, and he didn't know what she meant. Was it a question? A play? She stood there, stock still, the only sound her breath over her lips, and her eyes never left his face. Her lips were parted, her eyes were unfocused, and her chin seemed to tilt up as she were waiting, wishing, wondering when she would finally bend down and seal her fate. He felt himself say something. Her name, maybe. His chest grew tight, and his heart pounded. And suddenly, the impossible became the inevitable, and he realized that this time there was no stopping. This time it wasn't about his control, or his sacrifice, or his guilt. This time was for him. Okay, I guess I'm a bit tired and I want to stop now. Thank you very much for joining my live streaming today. I'm a bit tired because I read almost two chapters. Thank you very much for participating on my live streaming. And later I'll be back about maybe at 11 or at 1 to have English quiz. For now, I'll see you. Bye. I'll see you around.